Good to see everybody. So this coffee experts, we are going to talk more about finance, and we're kind of winding up the finance section as we get ready to push into next week. We're going to move back to people, and we're going to go 2.0. So what you can expect from coffee experts is just a continual progression upwards. So the things that we're going over, we're going to continue building on. So anything that we're talking about now is meant to kind of set the base layer, the foundation, for the sake of us building up. So we're going to get more and more technical the longer that you go into this. So we are going to set some base layer today. And what we're going to talk about today as we wind up finance is profitability, right? Because that's what it all comes down to. We've talked about cost of goods. We've talked about labor. We've talked about how we can cut costs. We've talked about growing sales. We talked about in marketing last month. But really, when it's all said and done, it just matters on if you're profitable, right? Because the other stuff is cool, but not that cool. So my first business, I thought I'd kick off with a story because I like stories. My first business was a skateboard snowboard shop. Corey remembers me in these days. We've known each other a long time.
I remember walking into that shop.
Yes, I remember you selling me SOS alarms in that shop. Anyway, we got so much stuff together, me and you, Corey Burkett. Anyway, long story short, I owned a skateboard snowboard shop, and I had come up in this business for some years. And they had owned several stores down in Southern California, and they had one store here in Southern Oregon. And it was because one of the brothers had moved here and then moved away. And so the store was just kind of floating up here remotely. And so when I moved here from Southern California, I did some church work, and then I ended up buying this skateboard snowboard shop because I knew it. I knew the business. I had run all the admin down south in Southern California. I had run one of their new locations that they had just opened, and then I'd come back to the mothership and run the whole hub for some time before I left. So when I moved up here to Southern Oregon and I saw that there was an opportunity to buy this location, I purchased it from them, divorced it from the rest of the chain, and just did my own thing. Just an independent skateboard snowboard shop, which was awesome for me because I had some of the biggest accounts. They had early Burton accounts, they had early Volcom accounts, they had early, like some of the biggest names at that time. I was able to grandfather in on the accounts they had because they were this big mega company down in Southern California, and I was just this little silo up in Southern Oregon. So it was great because I had these big accounts, and it felt really good, and it felt really cool, and it like all the skate kids loved to come in. I'd throw these big skate competitions, these big snowboarding competitions up on the hill. We'd bring out the barbecues. We do the whole. Felt so cool to do, but I'll never forget when my bookkeeper pulled me aside and she said, "Hey, this isn't working." And so we had to have some honest, very frank conversations about profitability. And she said, "Hey, I know you hit some spikes, but you need to be watching the rest of the year because your spikes aren't justifying the rest of the year. And when we're tying off your books at the end of the year, you're ending up more in debt than you're making money." And I had to make a really hard decision. We had done a lot of things. I'd really tried to change the direction of the ship because it wasn't like I didn't see it. It wasn't like I didn't feel it. I had made some big shifts. We had moved the location from a more expensive location across the street in the main mall where all the movie theaters and everything were, to directly across the street where the rent was a lot cheaper. Because I felt like I'll still poach off my same clientele base. They know me from across the street. They'll come across the street and the rent was like almost half. So I moved across the street, and it was kind of a more our thing. And then I really sized down the square footage. So I was trying to size down my rent because the other location was probably too big for what we were trying to do. So I really sized it down, and I was trying all the magic that I knew. But in the end, I couldn't change the ship enough because what happened was, and this was the killer, and this was what I learned, was my profitability couldn't survive because of how much I was having to order annually. So to have a Burton account, they require you to order at a minimum. They're not going to let you have a Burton account without ordering minimums. Well, for the amount of sales that I could do, it couldn't justify the minimums that I had to purchase. And therefore it left me with too much stock at the end of the year. Then I had to blow it out just to return the inventory for cash, right? But then I'm selling it a lot of times for at cost or sometimes even less than cost, and it's damaging my bottom line. So even though I sold some at top of the game, that's great. It didn't make up for the rest of them that I lost throughout the rest of the year. And I learned the hard lesson of, she said, "Hey, I think you need to stop gambling." I had pulled money out of my house, for the sake of investing in more and more inventory. Every year was going to be a better year, right? You tell yourself that. But and she and I talk about it today. She's my accountant to this day for Collab Team. She was my accountant back then, almost 20 years ago, for Hot Skis. So, but we joke about it from time to time. But the day that she pulled me aside and said, "Hey, you need to stop gambling." Like you're too into this business and it's not profitable and it's not turning. And she had to have it come to Jesus with me. And I really appreciated her for it because I felt like she helped me, not to lose my bacon. Now there's all kinds of like downstream from that. I feel like that was such a good lesson for me in business. And I feel like it's only contributed to why I do business the way I do now with the Collab team, all those different moving pieces. But I was so grateful that she had an honest conversation with me about profitability. And that's what we're doing here today. I'm not going to advise you to close your business. I mean, unless that's where you're at. But I am going to say, don't just turn a blind eye because it feels cool. Don't just turn a blind eye because your ego is involved. Don't just turn a blind eye because you keep telling yourself it's going to get better. For me, for the next couple of years, I was selling stuff out of the back of U-Hauls, I'm saying, like going to parking lots, setting up my wares, selling stuff down just to try and get some return on all my cash that I had outlaid. And man, super humbling for me to try and reclaim it. And I had all the best stuff, right? Because that's what you have when you're a snowboard owner, like a snowboard shop owner. So I had the best jackets, and everybody would always compliment me on my snowboard gear. And I'd be like, yep, that cost me 250 grand, because like that's how much I was still into this shop after I had closed it, like that. There's pain that can come out of getting over leveraged. And so what I would like to talk about today, and just have some real honest, frank conversations with everybody about, is the idea of profitability. So I'm going to share my screen. We're going to talk about some things. We're going to go back and forth from screen share to just conversation like this, but I just think it's a good thing for us to be working through together. So I'm going to share my screen and we can talk about it. So in the membership area, for those of you who are part of Coffee Experts Club, which unless this is your free first session, then all of you guys should have a membership area. It doesn't happen until you actually make your first payment. But once you're in the membership area on the home, there's a spot where it's going to let you choose what you're going to watch. And we're in finance right now. On the finance section, the free tools this month were the different finance templates. We looked at it early on in the month, the P&L for both a single location and multiple location. I'm going to look at this just for the sake of a reference because I feel like it helps us with numbers. So remember, as we look at this sheet, there are a couple different color significations, and that was the lighter gray, or the lighter color altogether, is the drive-throughs. The darker gray was the larger cafes, and then the darkest gray is the largest cafes we had. So those were all still drive-throughs. Everything that this coffee client did was through drive-throughs. They didn't have any sit-downs without drive-throughs, which I would highly recommend that you always do, only drive-throughs. But when you're thinking profitability is always something that you're going to come over here to the far column. When you're looking at the company total as a whole, you're going to slide down here to the bottom. Remember our colors were, this is COGS, this is labor, this is your overall liabilities, your total expenses. And then these columns here where it says net ordinary income, that's where you're going to look to find your profitability. And what that is your net ordinary income takes your top of the line number. You've heard us talk about top line number. So this one here, this total income line, and then it subtracts out the COGS, which give you your gross profit. And then you hold up against that. So COGS is just the cost of goods. What it goes into to make this money is these as your ingredients, right? So your total gross profit now, and then you subtract out all the things it takes to stay in business, and here's the chart of accounts. That may be cars, that may be rent, that may be insurance, that may be office supplies, maybe professional fees. Everybody's chart of accounts looks a little bit different, but then as you slide it down, this number here, the net ordinary income, this is what's left over after you subtracted out your COGS and all of your liabilities, all your expenses. And you get down to this number here. And then this percentage, the way you figure out profitability is you divide that net number there against your total income number here. And that's how you get your profitability. Now, different people do that different ways. Some people might have you divide it by this number here, gross profit, something south of COGS. Just depends on how you do your numbers. I like seeing it to total sales or total income because I feel like I can still affect these numbers here. I want to see what I can't affect is my sales. Just tell me how much I made, and then I can work with all the rest of the numbers. So that's why I use that number. But profitability is determined by taking your total income, holding it against your total sales, dividing it out, and that gets your percentage here. So when we talk profitability, that's what we're talking about. And I would say in the coffee business, usually 12 to 18% profitable is what you see. It's a high cash flow relatively low net business, which means you sell a lot of units, you move a lot of sales. I mean, look, this is 1 month of sales for this company. And this wasn't even a big month for them. I think this was, didn't we use January, Ben? Isn't this a January
I
number?
believe so, yeah. So a slower month.
Yeah, one of the slowest months we had, so $1 million in sales, but their net walking away was 126. So, just above 10%. So you wanted to see somewhere in that 12 to 18% rule. So when you're talking about something with a small profitability like that, or a small profitability from margin, when it comes to, there's some businesses that we're in, especially the online entrepreneur space, we're split pretty much right down the middle between online entrepreneur space and coffee. It's the damnedest thing. But so on the online entrepreneur side of things, it's not rare to see 30, 40, 50% profitability because their overhead is so low. They don't have a building to keep open. They don't need 5 to 10 employees at each one of those buildings. They're able to create products out of nothing, out of an idea, and throw up some video and create some content. And what did that really cost them? Pretty much just their own proprietary wisdom base to be able to put it out there, and then maybe the tools to get it out there. So their profitability is a lot higher. But when it comes to coffee, and restaurants is even lower, like you really, really need to understand your numbers because it's a high cash flow, low net business. So it's critical to be strategic in how you're using your profits. So as we talk about these things, I'm going to give you some starter questions, and this is going to be how we begin the conversation. We're going to look at a couple other things, but a lot of today is going to be theoretical because I can't answer for you where you're at in your business unless we did some strategic meeting. And if you want to contract with the Collab team and buy a project block, like we can get into pulling apart all your numbers, and I would love to do that with you. But I think that without looking at all your numbers, all I can give you is generalities of this is good rule of thumb. These are good questions to ask. So maybe put on your thinking cap today and be thinking about how could this be affecting my business? What should I be reflecting on in my own finance? And those are the kind of questions I'm going to start with today. So the questions I'm going to begin with today, these are the starter questions in regards to profitability is, I think a good place to start is how much should you pay yourself and how much should you leave in the business, right? Because that's the first thing you can control. The first thing you control is, let's say you're opening up your first stand and you're wondering, should I expect this to be paying me in the bills or should I not? I remember when I first was buying the skateboard snowboard shop, I talked to the attorney next door. Because he was an attorney that specialized in some things around business. And I wanted to get his perspective on purchasing business. I know he had owned a couple business. And as we were talking about it, I said, so what do you think about this business? Because I showed him the financials. I showed him all the things that we were working through. I talked about the location. I talked about the sales, talking about the potential in the area and the competition around, all the things you should be looking at. And he said, well, I'd feel a lot better about it if you weren't working it. Like for me, it was such a slap in the face on, wait, what'd you just say? Of course I'd be working it. It's my skateboard shop. It's my pride. It's my, I want to be in it. I want to do this. But what I didn't realize was, well, then what I was doing was buying myself a job. And I needed to be careful of that because I have 4 kids. I have a big house payment, which means what I need to make from this one stand is much different than me finding a manager who's maybe single and still living with mom and dad, or maybe is out on the apartment and sharing an apartment rent with 3 other people. Like their monthly nut is much lower than mine. So my profitability could really be a lot higher if it wasn't me working. And that was something that he tried to explain to me back then, but I was too young and too proud and thought I understood too much. And I learned the hard way. So I think that first things first is, how much should you pay yourself? How much should you leave in the business? I would say at the beginning, if you can start it without it being you behind the counter, that's what I would recommend. Like I would recommend you finding somebody who you can trust, who's a lower price point than you would need to make, but that you can invest in your extra time. And I would encourage you to keep your day job. That's just my advice. My advice is, if you've got a cash cow that's already providing income for you, that's the way I would lean, and then shape the culture of your business by the people that you hire. That's a much safer way to go. But let's say you're not there. Let's say you now have a couple of different locations. You're paying yourself. How much should you be paying yourself? I would say a lot of that depends on, what are your goals? Like, do you want to grow this business, or do you like just having the local coffee shop? Do you want to go for more than just 1 or 2, or is 1 or 2 just fine with you? Those things are going to dictate how much you should pay yourself and how much you should leave in the business. If you're thinking you want to grow, the more capital that you can leave in the business for the sake of putting money down for when you want to build your next location or when you want to buy a piece of property is the wisest way to go. Now, nobody likes that feeling. Nobody comes into coffee thinking, I'm just going to buy these unless it's their investment, unless it's their retirement, and they're just wanting to play a little bit or they're wanting to shape culture, but they don't really need it for the income. That's not usually where people start. And so that's why a lot of coffees you see go away because they started with too big of a monthly nut. And the coffee just couldn't justify it because their net wasn't big enough. So I'm going to hit a couple more, and then Ben, I'm going to ask you if you have some good insights, Drew, you as well. When you're looking at your profitability, are there numbers that aren't hitting your P&L? So let's look at the P&L again, because I think that's a very, very important thing to realize, because otherwise you could be gaming your numbers without realizing it. So things that are not going to show up on your P&L. All a profit and loss is intended to do is show you where your cash is going and where it's coming from. So your origin of cash is here: gross sales, gift card sales, bank interest income, things that is hitting your total income. Your COGS is your ingredients, right? Then your expenses is what's going to hit you south of the line, which is like we talked about, the different equipment maybe you've got, or and mostly it's just maintenance of that. Advertising and promotions a big one. If you have dues and memberships, if obviously we talked about insurance or office supplies, or wages is one that's always going to hit here. What's not going to hit here oftentimes is, do you have any debt? Like, are you paying debt? Because that's actually going to be reflected on your balance sheet. That's not necessarily something that's reflected in your monthly P&L. And so that's something that you've got to be aware of. Are there payments that are being made to an asset? Because that's the way that your profit and loss treats that. Are you paying down debt on one side? Because that's not going to hit you here. And that can begin to indirectly game your numbers. This particular client had us add in a 30% buffer for his taxes. He wanted to make sure that we were taking taxes out of every single store and that we were setting those aside so he didn't get bit. But obviously you can say that really drastically affects your profitability number. We dropped from 11% down to a 3%, but it was because he realized there are numbers that aren't hitting my P&L, and I want to see from a cash flow perspective, what are the things that aren't on here? So if you owe debt, if maybe you are wanting to pay tax out at the end of the year and that's not being represented in a payroll tax scenario where it's just you're setting aside cash to have to pay down some of the taxes that are due annually, it's important. I think also if there are notes, maybe it's not true debt, maybe you're not owing a bank, maybe you're not owing like certain people, but are there notes out there that people are expecting some kind of percentage on? Maybe you borrowed money from a family member, whatever it is, that they're expecting some kind of return on. That's not going to hit your P&L, and it can game your profitability number. And the reason why it's important not to game your profitability number is because it can lead you to making rash decisions that aren't based on true fact of how much cash you're operating from. So super, super important to come at your P&L with both eyes open and make sure you're looking at the right things. And then finally, the last of my starter questions is, what season is your business in? Like, are you growing, or are you infrastructuring up for future growth so you don't implode? There are two different sides of that. Maybe store 1, 2, 3, maybe 3 through 5, you're able to really not have to invest a lot into infrastructure because you pretty much have got the players, but you get much bigger than 5 or 6 locations. You better be thinking through how your team is communicating beyond just you to your manager, because then it becomes too much for you to bear. Like, is there some intermediary level that needs to be developed for the regional manager? What does the pay scale start looking like for these people as they ascend? We've been talking about that the last couple of weeks, giving them some kind of vision for future. Otherwise, you invest all of this money into your assets, which are your people, and they hemorrhage, they bail out because you don't have good escalation built into where they're going. Like, could they see themselves here in 10 years? Do you want them to see themselves here in 10 years? Like, those are all questions that you need to determine when it comes to what season your business is in. So that's kind of some of my first starter questions. Ben, Drew, I'll open it up, or Corey or Ryan, any of you guys can talk at this point, but just kind of, I don't want to be the only one talking. Any thoughts around the things shared so far?
Yeah, I like the idea of this, where you see your business, because there are a lot of companies. There's a couple companies here in Tri-Cities who they have 2 stands, and it's very apparent that that's totally okay. Like that's what they want. It was probably, a husband wife team, open up a couple locations, pays the bills. They, were able to buy a house off of it, and they're golden. So in that sense, like if I was that company, I wouldn't be maybe setting so much money aside for future growth. Maybe I'd be looking at, hey, I'm gonna set some money, keep some money in the business so that I can possibly actually buy these locations instead of leasing them, buy the land, and set up my future profitability even more. The idea of trying to figure out what you want to do with your business is really important, because what you want to do is going to drastically determine what your profitability is now or in 10 20 years from now. Because if you want to grow and you're not putting that money back into the business, it's not going to happen. You'll end up taking more lines of credit or more debt, and your profitability in the future will hurt because of it. But if you do want to grow, putting that money or keeping that money in the business is essential if you want to grow your profitability in the future and not your debt in the future. So it's a lot to think about. And I think most business owners probably get stuck in the day-to-day, especially if they're new entrepreneurs or new coffee shop owners. They've got, say, 2 locations. They're like, I can't think about the future. I'm just trying to think about keeping the shop open today. So if you can like take a step back and actually think, okay, where do I want this business to go? Like, do I want 5 locations? Do I want 10 locations? Do I want the responsibility of 10 locations that also comes along with the profitability of 10 locations? Yeah, a lot of thoughts you actually answered yourself.
That's a good question. It's probably something for everybody to be thinking through too, is with more money comes more stress. Like with more locations, there's no way around it. Incrementally ratchets up the stress too. Like even if you've got good systems in place, it's a lot of bodies, it's a lot of frenetic energy, it's a lot of pain points. There are a lot of equipment that can go down. There's a lot of people that could call out. There's a lot of managers that could quit. There's a lot of potential liability in legalities, like different things. So I think that really asking yourself, how am I built? Am I built to have a big business? Or am I built for, let's just make this the leanest, most profitable we can based on this many locations? Because maybe I have 5 and I'm excited about that. I don't want 10, but there are others that are like, no, let's run this thing until as far as it can go. And I think a lot of it depends on how you're wired. So being very honest with yourself, I think that's really good, Ben.
Yeah. I mean, even you've got state regulations, federal regulations to start kicking in once you have X amount of employees, X amount of profit or sales. In Washington State, I can't remember. It's been out of it for too long. Once you hit X number of employees, then your required benefits packages start kicking in. All of these things that you really want to think about, like you said, like, do I want to hold these responsibilities? Am I like that super go-getter? I'm going to make money, make as much money as I can all the time, go, go, go. Or am I like, bought a house, I go on vacation twice a year, I'm comfortable with that. Like, what kind of person are you is ultimately the question.
It's good.
No, I'll touch on this just from my experience. One of the hats that I got to wear for the corporate job that I held with BlackRock was franchise director. So I would get constant inquiries about wanting to open up a franchise, and they already had a location picked out and everything. And it was just that one in mind. And I think that when you start on a journey, you have to begin with the end in mind. And there are not many people that do that. They don't think beyond that one. So there's so many things to consider, like Ben and even you, Aaron, were pointing out to begin with, like, what is your end goal? And like, whatever your goal is, that's fine. If your goal is to only own and operate 1 or 2 because you're just looking to provide for yourself and your family, and you're just buying yourself a job, that's great. That is a great goal. So you just have to be very clear from the get-go what your end goal is, because that's going to determine everything from there. I mean, and along the journey too, you can adjust your goals. So even if you're already in this, even if you're already 1 or 2 or 3 locations in, it's okay to adjust those goals, but understanding that you need to have that articulated end. And now I'll talk from my ownership experience. Aaron, you pointed out that kind of what you would offer up as a suggestion is hire, a manager that you can trust, and don't plan on working in it or taking money from it, like work a day job. That was my story. I held a completely separate job because my end goal was to grow as quickly as possible, to put that money right back in. But if all of I'm doing is taking that money every month, then that gives me less to grow with. So right from the get-go, there's some hard questions that you have to ask yourself to articulate what that end goal is. But again, in my experiences, when people were looking into opening up a franchise, they only had that one location in mind. So I would ask those beginner questions. After that one, what's next? Can the demographics of where you're opening handle that? You know, if you want to grow to 10 locations, can you actually do that within the confines of the demographic that you want to operate in?
Yeah. If you're in Medford, probably not. You know what I'm saying? Like,
oh, come on, you got.
I mean,
plenty of
there's so much coffee, but it's like, man, it becomes an issue of, are there even any good locations left to put a coffee shop? Like what corners are you looking at? Like, are they zoned for that? I mean, obviously I think Southern Oregon is a radical example of like, and maximizing coffee as far as you want to pedal the bike, you know what I mean? But I do think when CJ and Linz came to me, Ryan walked him in my door. When CJ and Linz came to me and were wanting to talk about Outsider, and they were so jazzed about it, the first thing I told Ryan, when Ryan's like, hey, I've got some friends that want to open a coffee shop in Southern Oregon, do you have any advice? And I said, yeah, open it somewhere else. Like that was let's find you someplace else that's not as saturated, because there's so much competition. So it's not just like, can you be better than the person there? It's what kind of are there any A locations left, or has Dutch swept them all up? Like, has human beings swept them all up? Is BlackRock, like those guys are high level corporate people looking for A+ sites at all opportunities. Be very honest with how many locations are here and how much growth am I hoping to pedal out of the area I'm in? And I think those are very, very good questions to come. Think with Ed in mind, Corey. That's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, and is that one location going to, is it going to pay your bills? If you're just at one location, is it going to pay your bills in 5 years? That's the story around here. Is we see them all the time. The little drive-through pop-up pops up and disappears 6 months later. It's like, oh, sales weren't good enough, couldn't pay your bills, and so you had to bail. And so like the location, the demographic, what your sales are, the saturation, like at the end of the day, that's all going to affect your profitability. And if you are going into it saying, I just want to be able to pay my bills with this one stand, you're really going to have to look hard at all of those things to make sure it's even feasible at that point.
I think the nice thing about having multiple locations is that, you've got a reference on like, what's a strong location versus a sleeper. I mean, like what can I go into this location probably expecting somewhere in the spectrum of? And if you've refined down your numbers, like we've been talking about, looking at the profit loss, really drilling down on COGS, really drilling down on labor, then you can kind of predict your money, which is what I feel like Wes got really good at doing with roasters. Is he just knew, if I open this here, it's going to come in somewhere in this window, which is going to give me this much more cash, which is going to profit me this much more in the future as I invest it back into the business. He created some good momentum. Sometimes at the beginning, it's hard with that, right? You've got 1, 2, 3, 4 locations. It's harder to have that kind of vision. But after you start picking up that momentum, I would say at 3 locations is where you really start seeing the sweet spot of momentum start to build. Then you can start making strategic decisions, because it's not just one window you're putting coffee out. It's 3 locations, and maybe you have just a cash cow, and then you have a sleeper, but there's some spread in between. And then I think you start making some strategic decisions on what kind of location do I open next. There was a location that Wes looked at in Spokane that was the worst ingress egress possible. So which meant like the way people get in, the way people get out, which means you're not going to do good on sales. People driving to work do not want to fight their way into your coffee stand and fight their way out of your coffee stand. That's not what they want to do. They see something like that, they're going to avoid it and go to the guy 2 blocks down the street. But this location was a flagship. It was like the hub of Spokane. It was like everybody came and went on this corner, and there was decisions we made of, hey, are we going to open here with the understanding of this will never be a killer store, but it will give us so much brand notoriety in this new market share. We were just piercing into Spokane, and he knew, okay, so there are different kinds of stores I'm going to open. Some I'm opening intending for it to help pull its weight, and other ones I'm opening up as a marketing flagship to announce we're here for the sake of visibility. When I open up other locations, it's going to help the collateral energy of them all, because people have seen my sign so much in this new area, and it's telling them I'm here and to be watching for me. So I think there are different windows of time, but that comes back to where you're at in your business, and what kind of decisions you're making. Some of the questions that would be follow-up questions that come out of that is, should I be paying off debt? All right. Should I be investing in property? Like that's usually the first 2 things that people start asking is, hey, I don't like carrying a lot of debt. Should I start using my money towards my debt? Or should I be making investments in property? Because, and there are answers for both of that. I would say realize as you get in, you're getting into debt. Like if you're starting a business, like that's probably the name of the game. Like you're going to be taking out like notes on your house. Probably you're going to like, they're going to want personal guarantees. Any of these landlords you sign into leases with, they don't know you. You haven't proven yourself yet. So of course they're going to want a physical asset that they can repo if you go south on the money that they've loaned out to you. So I think that coming into it, understanding that there's debt in business, I would say, and you have to be okay with that out of the gates of, there's probably going to be some risk in this. There's probably going to be some debt load that I have to take on. Eventually, I would say after you get to those places where you've used your debt to get you to a place where you're at maybe 3 locations, you can start making some critical decisions. We're going to talk about some of those decisions in a minute, where you can maybe start cutting down some costs and putting away some money. I would say carrying a decent debt to income ratio so that you can go to the banks and ask them for loans for other things like buying a piece of property. You know, I mean, I think that rent control is beautiful. If you can have a piece of property that you're going to build on and that you're going to own, and then someday if you sell your business, that you can continue to own the property, and that your old business that you sold off is going to continue to pay rent to you for the years to come. Like that's, I mean, that's how money is made in America right there. Like it's old money is owning real estate that you can charge rent for and continue to increase it as inflation increases. So I think that obviously buying property is going to give you more reserves and assets. Banks usually like to loan against more, the more and more you own, but there is some debt into it. And so I'd say making sure that you keep that fine balance of what is your bank going to require from you to be able to take the next loan? Is there a debt to income ratio that you need to be aware of? And so maybe there are times where you're paying down your debt to get to that range so that you can borrow more to go to the next one. But I'd say realizing that business is a gamble. You know, people ask Ben and I all the time. Drew might not fall in this camp because he's still too young. But people ask Ben and I all the time, why don't you guys open up your own coffee shop? And I think the answer is very, very simple. I don't want the risk.
Nope.
Like I think that I lost my shirt pretty bad on skateboard, snowboard shops. And so for me, doing a consulting business like this where I can help other businesses grow, I'd rather grow this kind of a business that doesn't have as much liability, but there isn't as much money in this business as there is in coffee. Like if you can get into coffee and you can open up 10 stands, there's a lot of money to be made in that, but there is a lot of risk in that. And there's some people that are wired more for risk and others that aren't, you know? And so I feel like for me, I'll gain education, I'll help others grow, but that's not necessarily something I'm looking to go do. Now, Drew, I know has bigger dreams. Drew, you want to talk about that for a minute? Tell me about your dreams for just a second.
Well, I've always had high aspirations, but the boots on the ground kind of training that I had in my previous job taught me a lot about risk and reward. And I saw us fail with a lowercase f multiple times. But it's exhilarating, you know, it's exciting. I know you said some people are more wired for risk. Well, I haven't failed with a capital F enough times to stop wanting to be risky. So we'll see what the next 10 years brings me.
And I think you're in a perfect window. Like, I love it, Drew. I love your heart. I love, like, you bring such good energy to the table, and your station of life. You're not married yet. You don't have kids yet. You don't have a mortgage yet. So you can afford to take more risks right now and live a little bit more on the wild side, because your potential for failure is far less than somebody that's carrying some of those bigger, you know, that they've got some of those bigger things that I've got. Maybe I'd be more risky if I didn't have to think about my wife or my kids. You know, I mean, maybe I'd do things different if I didn't have such a big monthly nut with my house. You know, like, I think you've made some really wise decisions. And I was always really impressed with you at Roasters with how much you saved. Like, you lived really frugal for the sake of just like socking it away. And then when franchise opportunity came up, Drew was able to say, I'm ready. I've got money. Let's go do this, you know, and it was commendable. And I think I'm excited for you for that. So I think probably working through what season of life you're in, thinking through what risk means, not only for you, but for the people that are around you, how much you love them, you know, like,
I should have done with that franchise was bought a house, man. That would have been, I could have just sold it and cashed out.
Oh man. What were you saying? What'd you say, Corey? Do it now?
I was just telling Drew, do it now before you get more responsibilities. You know, on the subject of, you know, buying property or not, that's what we were faced with as we were pursuing a second location. And this is where I think it's very important to educate yourself on all of the options that are available to you, right? So on our first location, we actually went the SBA route. We got an SBA loan. It was actually a fantastic process for us, but it was a 10-year loan. And then, because those were the terms of the SBA. So really educating yourself on the terms of different loans. So on a second location, as we got in discussions with this developer, first of all, the lease that they were expecting just did not make sense. I mean, it just did not make sense. So then we went the route of investigating and talking through, well, what does it look like for us to buy the parcel that we would be on? Because that's a different kind of loan that we can get. That turns into a 25-year loan.
Yeah.
And it's all about a numbers game, right?
Mhm.
So as we factored that in, that's what opened up that opportunity, was looking down that road. Now, our plan with that was not to get into commercial land ownership. We wanted to open more coffee shops because our end game was to open as many as we could in 10 years and then sell them.
Yep.
And that was our end goal. So our motivation was coffee shops. So part of our motivation and part of our plan that we had was buy this property, put a coffee shop on it, set for a few years, secure lease to ourselves, and then flip that property. Because the proceeds of that would have given us money to go for the next two. So it just sped up that process. So again, it comes down to, what is that end and long-term game that you have. So, but educating yourself on all the options that are out there and the different loans, if that's the route you need to go, opens up different doors that you otherwise would have never even known existed.
That's good. That's really good. Thank you for that, Corey. I love that. Something we saw Wes do that I saw Wes do that I thought was really impressive, is that, and Wes is the only client I've had that has grown at his rate as fast as he had and then exited. Like Wes's story is pretty amazing. He came from nothing, started with one location, built it up to 16 and a roastery, and exited, was bought out. I think that's for most people like their ultimate dream, unless they want to own a coffee shop forever, which is awesome too. You know what I mean? But I think that something Wes started doing later in his game, as he got wiser and wiser, I thought, was creating buckets from the money that he's collected, like creating buckets of, okay, I'm going to put this towards taxes for future. I'm going to put this towards lifestyle for future. I'm going to put this towards investments for future, and he would create these buckets and spread out a percentage of all of his earnings into each one of those buckets monthly and annually, so that he had reserves. And I think that's so smart to be thinking about, who talks about that a lot is there's a book out there called Profit First, and it's by a guy named Mike Michalowicz. Great book, reads really great. The audiobook's amazing because he reads it himself. He's funny. But it's a great book when it talks about thinking about profit first, like Corey was saying, starting with the end from the beginning. I think it is a great thing, and thinking through it that way. Some of the take homes that we had talked about that I wanted to kind of kick open conversation around was, like, don't be surprised by the change of seasons and the change of the take home. That could be anybody's, like you think you're going to live in spring and summer all year long, and it just doesn't work like that, so being very, very careful not to get surprised by big spends towards the end of the year, like taxes. That's something that really can fall into the pain point of making strategic decisions with the extra cash that can increase profitability in the future. We've talked about DrinkWorks and the service that we offer with DrinkWorks of creating your own energy drink. That was like gold for Wes, because he saw that investing, I think it costed Wes, because he had so many locations, because you buy the proprietary ability to create energy drinks and then all of the first batch of ingredients. I think it was like 70 grand for Wes to invest in doing his own energy drink, but it was because he had so many locations, we needed enough ingredients for all those locations. But for Wes, he realized, wait, I'm paying 45 grand out to Red Bull every month, and making my own is going to cost me 70. Yeah, let's do that. Because you realize that if you can drop your price 5 times the amount, Red Bull's way up here at 5 times the amount, 5 times less than that, I realized a $70,000 investment is nothing. I'm going to have that paid off by the end of the year. And we've talked about Wes's story before, just by creating his own energy drinks. He opened 2 new locations, year 1 savings alone, because he realized how much COGS he could save by cutting out the middleman. So I think, like, being mindful of strategic decisions you can use your profitability for now that could buy you greater profitability in the future. I think another thing would be careful not to waste your money on things that don't move the needle, or get excited when you see all the top line cash and go blow it. Like that, for people that don't come from money, like you see $1 million month, dude, let's go to Vegas, let's go to wherever it is that you want to go, and let's go live large. But the danger can be, just remember, you're a high cash flow low net business. So be careful. Like, yeah, you've got some good money down there at the bottom, but that money needs to be stretched across the year, and make sure you're being wise with it. So be careful of extravagant travel, expensive cars, big shifts in the business. I know, Ben, you want to talk about that a little bit. One of our clients moving from G Suite.
Yeah, G Suite. Yeah, I would call that one of those lateral business moves that costs you a lot of money and brings nothing in return. We like the business infrastructure, the backbone of reporting, communication, everything was through Google, through G Suite. It was free services, and they're great. They're fast. They're built for flexible businesses. And we decided to flip the script and move the whole company over to Microsoft Teams, which is $1,000 investment, thousands of dollars, because we had to have tech guys come in, set up everything, set up VPNs inside all the shops, private networks in all the shops, get Microsoft Teams on board. And it was, in my opinion, Microsoft Teams sucked. I hate it compared to G Suite. It's not nearly as flexible. It's very rigid corporate business structure inside even their UI. And it costs us thousands of dollars to go, okay, now instead of emailing from Gmail, we email from Microsoft.
And I mean, there were reasons, like there was security around it, like there was all the reasons they had, like all the reasons behind it. But like Ben said, it felt like a very lateral move. Like we probably could have just made G Suite more robust if our biggest concern was security. But this company really talked this business into a shift, and it ended up costing them thousands of dollars. And in the end, they actually shifted back to G Suite. So it just meant they outlaid all this cash for several years only to shift back to what we had in the first place. And I think that being really careful to ask yourself, does this decision move the needle? Like, am I going to get a lot of needle movement out of this, or am I just outlaying cash? And I think that's something to be careful of.
Yeah, and that's hopefully, I mean, if you're a business owner or an entrepreneur, you have ideally those people around you or on your teams that are more operationally minded or more directive minded, because of course, as the entrepreneur or the visionary, you're gonna go, this looks great over here. I think it'll do great for our business. Maybe they thought a little bit about how it might move the needle. In reality, they're seeing it move. They're thinking it's going to move the needle, hugely in the profit section, but really it's just going to move it laterally. Like it'll just maybe shift cash from one spot of the business over the other spot of the business. Ideally, you have somebody on your team who goes, actually, having a different email signature isn't going to really help us in the profit section too much more. Or you know what? These tools that we're using are just fine. Let me show you how they're using, and gives the visionary or the owner at least some insight. I mean, I called it being a no guy. You need a no man on your team to go, I don't think that's a good idea.
And those guys aren't always popular. I mean, like,
no, they're not.
Ben was not always popular as the no guy. But I do think, and I mean, in that client's example, I fought hard for us not making the shift, but in the end, the visionary makes the decision, and if they are set, this is where you're going to go, like all you can do is push back before you do start becoming an obstacle. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, well, it's this guy's money. If that's the way he wants to spend it, then that's the way we can go. But I think that really working through what you're spending your money on, I would say, look for places you can cut costs, but I would say don't ever cut corners. There's some danger in cutting corners. There's a lot of risk that can happen as you get bigger and bigger if you start cutting corners. I know for one of our clients, he got bit really hard for taxes on gift cards. He hadn't been paying taxes on gift cards because you could kind of float that under the wire a little bit, but then he got called on the carpet by the state, and it cost him to the tune of a couple $100,000 because of back tax he had to pay. And like that's just ugly. That just hurt. That there's no way you can make that feel good. You know what I mean? But it felt good all that time cutting corners. I mean, they knew what they were doing, but it didn't feel good when you have to pay the piper. So I'd say cut costs, don't cut corners. One of the spots you don't want to ever cut corners or cut costs is hiring excellent experts. Like I would say, find a great CPA, not just the guy that your dad's been using or somebody that's used at a different level in business. Like ask yourself, can my CPA keep up with the growth I want to do? Is my bookkeeper excellent at what they do if you're not doing your own? Like asking, don't cut corners when it comes to experts, because you're going to need them. That's a guarantee. If Uncle Sam comes knocking on your door and telling you how much more you need to do, you need somebody that can prove why you don't need to pay that much more, because they're an expert. They know what they're talking about.
That's what I was just going to say. Understand where your level of experts exist and where they don't. I think that your opening story, Aaron, was a great illustration of that.
Yeah.
And, whether you're a solo, owner,
Yep.
you need to have that, because even though maybe you're not working the day to day, but you are, in the sense that you're just engulfed within your business, you kind of need to have that person that's one step removed that can have that come to Jesus talk, like you pointed
Yeah.
out, that your person had to have with you, of like, listen, like, here's what I'm seeing. Here's the trajectory this is going. Like,
Yeah.
we need to really analyze some things. So surrounding yourselves with that kind of expertise. So understand and know where your limits are at and be okay with that. And then purpose to surround yourself with the people that see those different angles.
Yep.
I had a partnership, and it worked out great because there was this beautiful tension.
Yep.
Of, I was the risk taker, he was super conservative. So he ran the numbers, I ran the operations and the people, and I would pull this way and he would kind of pull back that way, because sometimes we can be overly conservative, but we can also be overly on the risk side. So having that balance of counsel around you through CPA, through a bookkeeper, through a business partner, I think that those are important elements, because all of those are going to affect that bottom line and your profitability. So understand your limits.
Yeah, that's good. I think too, just to wind up, we got 10 minutes left. We'll jump over to Slido, just hit a couple of those questions. But the final couple of thoughts are, maybe you're watching this and you're thinking to yourself, well, I don't even make these decisions. It's my boss above me. Realize that you influence the decisions that are being made. Like a lot of the ways that you complain about things, or the new solutions that you find about things, be thinking about things like you're the owner. If you want to be elevated in a company, think about it like an owner. Like, come up with, if you've got a good suggestion, make sure you're justifying how the cost is going to be afforded. Like, how are you going to make money out of making a decision? Like, or is this just another expense we're taking on without thinking through, oh, I've got, like the example of Microsoft Office, where we had to buy a seat for every person who wanted an email address like that. We had to buy a seat in Microsoft, like going from no cost to some cost. Well, that's just money taken out of my bottom line. Like that, there's nothing I can do for return investment. But there are some things where it's like, hey, I think we should start doing marketing this way, and maybe investing in a social media marketing platform where I can post multiple different things all at the same time. And the savings in that is you're going to have to pay me less hourly to manage your social media by me making an investment in this one-time tool that's cheaper than my hourly rate. Now you're thinking like an owner. Okay, so there are going to be times you're going to spend money, but how can I spend money in something that's actually going to be saving money in the end? So I think be mindful of how you're influencing things. And then these are the last couple of things that we just want to throw out there, and then I'll move to Slido, and that is critical thinking steps to determine how you're making decisions. So I'm going to pepper you with a few. Number one, does it increase the bottom line? Every question you have to ask, not the top line. Is this going to increase the bottom line? Because sometimes you may have a great idea for this. Let's do this promo. Well, that's fine, but how much more labor is it going to cost me to do that promo? And in the end, is the bottom line going to still be profitable? Or did we just create a bunch of frantic energy to not have very much yield, maybe even make less that day because of how much labor we had to pay out? So I think thinking through things about, number one, does it increase the bottom line? Is the decision you're making for future growth or current growth? Like having some real come to Jesus, because there's sometimes where you just need to be honest with yourself on, is this going to grow me now or in the future? And just being really clear on what the goal is in the decisions that you're making. Number three would be consider operational pain point implications. Could this change increase labor? Could it make it less profitable? We talked about that already. Number four, evaluate, is this a good decision after you make it? And being willing to stop if it's not. I think that it's like, don't get so much ego involved in your decisions that you can't pull the plug. Ben and I, as we were prepping for the call, talked about there was a location within one of our clients that they probably should have just closed or made a big decision shift far before they did. But because they committed to, it has to be this certain way, there were like 5 years of no profitability at this location. Like it was not any value to the company, but the owner's ego was really wrapped up and it had to be this way. And it was different than the rest of the brand. And because there weren't some good like symbiotic energies put at it, it just didn't make very much money. And as soon as they shifted it in line to be with the rest of the company, it immediately started being profitable. And so I think, like, be honest with your decisions and ask yourself, is this a good decision, or do I need to stop? Do I need to quit? Do I need to shift? It was really hard for me to wind down the skateboard snowboard shop. but like that was the best thing I ever did. Thank God I'm not still doing skateboards, snowboards. Thank God. Like I'm so grateful. So much stress because that was right before the online boom, where almost everything, so much brick and mortar went away. You know what I mean? Like so many of like went to solely online, and it would have just been a totally different game anyway. So don't be afraid to admit there could be a decision that needs to be shifted.